When my son got married, I kept a massive secret hidden beneath the grease stains of my old mechanic uniforms. I never told him about the $120 million my late wife left behind. It turned out to be the smartest decision I ever made in my entire 65 years on this earth. Just 5 days after the wedding bells stopped ringing, his new wife showed up uninvited at my front door, with a ruthless lawyer by her side and a plan to throw me out on the street. Before I dive deep into this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family member who entirely underestimated your true worth. I was sitting in the living room wiping down my favorite socket wrench with an old rag. The smell of motor oil and citrus cleaner hung in the air, just as it had for the past 40 years. This house was not a mansion, but it held the echoes of a lifetime. The worn armrests of my recliner, the scuff marks by the front door, where my son Eric used to drop his heavy school boots, and the faint scent of vanilla that always reminded me of my late wife Diana. It was a quiet Tuesday morning. I expected nothing more than a cup of black coffee and a few hours under the hood of a classic Mustang I was restoring. That peaceful illusion shattered when a violent pounding echoed through the house. The heavy oak front door rattled on its hinges. Before I could reach it, Natalie used a key Eric had given her and pushed the door wide open. Natalie stepped over the threshold without a shred of hesitation. She wore a pristine white designer coat and a pair of sunglasses perched perfectly on her head. Her high heels clicked sharply against the hardwood floor. Right behind her walked a tall man in a tailored gray suit clutching a thick leather briefcase. Natalie did not offer a greeting. She did not ask how my morning was going. She marched straight to the center of the living room and slammed a thick stack of legal documents onto my glass coffee table. The loud smack echoed against the walls. She crossed her arms and stared at me with a look of absolute disdain. I looked from her to the man in the suit. He introduced himself coldly as Mr. Peterson, representing Natalie and Eric Sullivan. Natalie interrupted him before he could finish his rehearsed legal introduction. She pointed a manicured finger at the papers on the table and declared that this house now legally belonged to Eric. She stated with absolute arrogance that she needed to sell the property immediately to secure capital for a new business venture she was launching. She demanded the keys and told me to clear out. I set my wrench down slowly on the rag. I looked her directly in the eyes and refused to hand over anything. I built this house with my own hands, and I paid off the mortgage 20 years ago. Peterson stepped forward with a condescending sigh. He opened the folder and pointed to a specific line at the bottom of the purported possession notice. My heart stopped beating for a fraction of a second. Right there in blue ink was the unmistakable signature of my own son Eric acting as the primary guarantor of the transfer. The back door in the kitchen creaked open. Eric walked slowly into the hallway. He wore a brand new expensive suit that looked entirely out of place on his slumping frame. He kept his eyes glued to the floorboards, deliberately avoiding my gaze. Seeing him cower behind his wife was more painful than the eviction notice itself. I asked him if this was a joke. I asked him if he really signed away the home where he took his first steps. Eric shifted his weight nervously and mumbled that he needed a fresh start. He claimed that the burden of maintaining this old property was holding him back from achieving his true potential. He looked around the living room and sneered at the modest furniture. He told me that my life was incredibly dull and that he refused to end up like a failed mechanic who spent his entire life covered in dirt and engine grease. His words felt like physical blows. He did not stop there. Eric pointed toward the mantel and stated that he did not want to end up like his mother either. He called Diana a foolish woman who wasted her best years staring at a computer screen, writing useless software that amounted to absolutely nothing. My chest tightened as the drip of his toxic backstory hit the air. Diana had spent countless sleepless nights in this very room coding the foundation of a cybersecurity program that would eventually be acquired by a major tech conglomerate. She sacrificed her sleep and her health to build an empire in the shadows. We agreed to keep the wealth hidden from Eric, so he would learn the value of hard work and build his own character. Looking at the arrogant coward standing in my hallway, I realized our silent sacrifices had only produced a greedy and ungrateful stranger. Eric cleared his throat and slid a crumpled piece of paper across the table. He told me that Natalie had graciously rented a small basement apartment across town for me. He expected me to pack up my entire life and move into a damp, lightless cellar so they could fund their luxurious lifestyle. Natalie walked over to the fireplace mantel with a smirk playing on her lips. She picked up the silver-framed photograph of Diana. It was my favorite picture, showing Diana smiling brightly on a beach in Florida long before her illness took hold. Natalie let out a harsh laugh and called my beautiful wife a penniless dreamer who left behind nothing but dust and bad memories. She tossed the frame carelessly back onto the mantel, where it tipped over and fell flat against the wood. She turned to me and issued her final ultimatum. She gave me exactly 48 hours to pack my miserable belongings and vacate the premises, or she would have Peterson call the sheriff to physically remove me. Any other father might have exploded in rage. Any other man might have shouted, cursed, or thrown them out of the house by force. I did none of those things. I simply stood up and looked at the fallen photograph. I let absolute silence stretch across the room until the tension became almost suffocating. I did not raise my voice or shed a single tear. I gave a slow, deliberate nod and told them I would pack my things. Natalie smiled a victorious, wicked smile. She linked her arm through Eric's and led him out the front door. Peterson followed closely behind, leaving the eviction notice sitting on the table. They walked away entirely convinced that the old mechanic was completely broken and defeated. They had absolutely no idea that my silence was not surrender. It was the spark igniting a fuse that would detonate their entire world. The moment the heavy front door clicked shut, the atmosphere in the house shifted. I walked over to the mantel and gently stood Diana's picture upright. I wiped a speck of dust from the glass and promised her that I would handle this. I went to the hall closet and pulled out a battered leather suitcase, tossing a few worn shirts and greasy denim trousers inside. I needed them to believe I was truly packing for the basement. Then I sat down in my recliner and pulled out my mobile phone. I scrolled past my usual contacts and dialed a number I rarely used. The phone rang twice before a sharp, professional voice answered. It was Michael Rhodes. Michael was not just a lawyer. He was the brilliant wealth manager who had navigated the sale of Diana's company and quietly protected our massive fortune for the past decade. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I gave Michael a set of extremely precise instructions. I told him to immediately unfreeze the trust account containing the $120 million from the corporate merger. I then ordered him to launch a comprehensive and ruthless financial investigation into Natalie. I wanted to know every single detail about her credit history, her hidden bank accounts, her business dealings, and her family background. Michael did not ask unnecessary questions. He simply promised to call me back with the intelligence. I sat in the quiet house watching the dust motes dance in the sunlight streaming through the windows. Exactly 20 minutes later, my phone vibrated in my hand. Michael delivered a report that completely altered the battlefield. Natalie was not a successful businesswoman looking for startup capital. She was drowning in a spectacular ocean of toxic debt. She had multiple failed shell companies, massive credit card deficits, and a trail of unpaid loans. Michael revealed the darkest truth of all. Natalie had not targeted my house just to sell it. She was planning to leverage the property as collateral for a massive illegal loan from black market creditors. She was using my son as a pawn to save herself from complete financial ruin. The elevator doors opened to the penthouse floor of Rhodes Financial. I stepped onto the polished marble, wearing the same faded denim jacket and work boots I had worn for 20 years. The receptionist did not blink or question my presence. Michael had trained his staff well. They knew the man looking like a retired auto mechanic was their firm's most heavily guarded account. Michael waited for me inside his corner office. The room was enclosed in floor-to-ceiling glass, overlooking the city skyline. It was a world entirely disconnected from the grease and motor oil of my garage. I sat down in a leather chair that cost more than most people made in a month. Michael did not offer me a drink or engage in small talk. He simply slid a thick manila folder across the immaculate mahogany desk. I opened the folder. The first page was a summary of Natalie and her financial history. I expected to find a few maxed-out credit cards, or maybe a failed boutique business. What I found was a sophisticated web of financial ruin. Natalie was not a struggling entrepreneur. She was a financial predator. Michael walked me through the documents page by page. Over the past 7 years, Natalie had registered 4 different limited liability companies. Each one was a hollow shell. She used them to secure lines of credit, lease luxury vehicles, and rent high-end office spaces. Before the creditors could collect, she would drain the accounts, bankrupt the shell company, and move on to the next scheme. She left a trail of destroyed vendors and unpaid contractors in her wake. I stared at the numbers, feeling a cold knot form in my stomach. I asked Michael how she managed to stay out of federal prison. Michael explained that she always operated right on the edge of legality, using corporate bankruptcy laws to shield her personal assets. But her luck had finally run out. Her personal credit was completely annihilated. She could no longer secure a loan from any legitimate financial institution in the country. That was where my son came in. I looked at a photograph of Eric and Natalie on their wedding day, tucked into the file. Eric had a perfect credit score. I knew this because I had helped him build it. When Eric turned 18, I sat at the kitchen table with him and Diana, teaching him how to manage a credit card. I co-signed the loan for his first used sedan. I drilled the importance of financial integrity into his head every single day. Diana and I made sure he started his adult life with a pristine financial record. We thought we were giving him a head start. Instead, we had inadvertently painted a target on his back. Natalie did not marry my son for love. She married him for his social security number. I turned to the next section of the dossier, and the details grew even darker. Michael tapped a specific document. It was a preliminary loan application. Natalie was currently seeking a cash injection of $1 million. She was not applying at a bank. She had approached a shadow lending syndicate. These were not people who sent polite letters when a payment was missed. They were ruthless black market creditors who demanded collateral that could be easily liquidated. The application listed a single asset to secure the $1 million loan. It was my house. The pieces of the puzzle slammed into place with terrifying clarity. Natalie needed Eric to sign the eviction notice to establish his primary residency and ownership claim. She needed me out of the house immediately so she could push through a rapid appraisal and finalize the property transfer. Once the house was firmly in Eric's name, she planned to use her status as his legal spouse to leverage the property. She was going to hand the deed to criminal lenders, take the $1 million in cash, and leave Eric holding the bag when she inevitably defaulted. My son was being led to the slaughterhouse, and he was smiling the entire way. The weight of her betrayal dug deep into my chest. That house was not just a piece of real estate. It was the very place where Diana had built our hidden empire. I remembered the countless nights Diana sat at a cramped desk in our living room typing lines of code until her fingers cramped. She poured her brilliance and her health into a software program that changed our lives forever. She did not do it for fame or luxury. She did it to secure a future for our family. Natalie was plotting to hand 30 years of our memories and Diana's honest labor over to street thugs to fund a fake lifestyle. My first instinct was pure paternal rage. I wanted to grab my phone and dial Eric's number. I wanted to slam these documents onto the hood of his expensive leased car and force him to read every single line. I wanted to shake him until he woke up from whatever spell this woman had cast over him. I reached into my jacket pocket, gripping the edge of my phone, but my hand stopped. I looked out the glass window at the sprawling city below. I forced the anger down, burying it under decades of calculated patience. If I called Eric right now, he would not believe me. He was completely blinded by her. He would look at the documents, and Natalie would immediately spin a web of lies. She would cry. She would claim the documents were fabricated by a jealous old man who could not handle letting go of his house. She would convince Eric that I was trying to destroy his marriage out of spite. Eric would take her side. He had already proven that by standing behind her while she threw me out of my own home. If I confronted them now, I would lose my only element of surprise. I would show my hand too early, and Natalie would simply find another way to ruin him. She would adapt her strategy, and I would be permanently cut out of their lives, unable to stop the final blow. I pulled my hand away from my phone. I closed the manila folder and slid it back toward Michael. The expression on my face must have shifted, because Michael leaned back in his chair, observing me carefully. I told Michael that we were not going to intervene. We were not going to block the property transfer or warn the authorities about the fraudulent loan application just yet. We were going to let Natalie proceed exactly as she planned. I needed her to sign those shadow loan documents. I needed her to commit the fraud entirely on paper, leaving an undeniable criminal trail that no amount of crying could erase. I was going to let her walk willingly into her own trap. I instructed Michael to monitor the shadow syndicate and track the exact moment the loan was approved. Natalie thought she was playing a brilliant game against a helpless old mechanic. She had no idea she had just stepped onto a chessboard where I controlled every single piece. I stood up from the leather chair, adjusting the collar of my worn denim jacket. The silence in the office was heavy with anticipation. I told Michael to prepare the next phase. I was going to move into the dark basement apartment she had rented for me. I was going to play the role of the defeated father perfectly. Let her believe she had won. Her arrogance would be the very weapon I used to destroy her. The air in the basement apartment was thick with the smell of mildew and old dust. It was exactly this kind of place you put someone when you wanted them to be entirely forgotten. A single naked light bulb hung from the low ceiling, casting harsh shadows against the concrete walls. Water dripped slowly from an exposed pipe, landing in a rusted metal sink with a hollow echo. Natalie had chosen this damp, lightless cellar for me. She wanted me to feel small. She wanted me to feel entirely powerless. I set my worn leather suitcase on the sagging mattress of the twin bed. I did not unpack. I simply sat on the edge of the mattress, letting the reality of my son's betrayal wash over me in the silence. I was a man worth $120 million sitting in a basement that smelled like rotting wood, playing the part of the defeated old mechanic. My mobile phone vibrated in my pocket, shattering the quiet of the cellar. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. It was Eric. I let it ring 3 times before I finally answered, keeping my voice low and weary to match the character they expected. Eric did not ask how I was settling into the basement. He did not ask if I had enough food or if the heating worked. His voice was entirely rushed and laced with a frantic, anxious energy. He told me that Natalie had just found a highly motivated cash buyer for the house. According to this buyer wanted to close the deal by the end of the week. Eric claimed the title company needed one final piece of paperwork to ensure a smooth transition. He demanded that I meet them at a local coffee shop in 1 hour to sign a document officially relinquishing any right to contest the property transfer. I held the phone to my ear, listening to the nervous tremor in my son's voice. He was lying. I knew exactly why he was rushing. There was no cash buyer. Natalie was pushing the paperwork through to secure her $1 million shadow loan from the black market syndicate. She needed my legal surrender to finalize the collateral. As Eric continued to ramble about how this sale was going to give him the fresh start he deserved, a specific memory surfaced in my mind. Hearing the eager, greedy tone of his voice transported me back 12 years. Eric was 18 years old, sitting at our kitchen table, holding an acceptance letter to a prestigious private university. He had looked at me with tears in his eyes, knowing we could never afford the exorbitant tuition on a mechanic's salary. That very same afternoon, I walked out to the garage and looked at my prized possession. It was a pristine, restored 1969 Ford Mustang. I had spent 8 years tracking down original parts and rebuilding the engine with my own bare hands. It was my masterpiece. I loved that car, but I loved my son more. I sold the Mustang the next morning to a private collector. I took the check directly to the bank and paid for Eric's entire first year of college in cash. I never told him how much it broke my heart to watch a tow truck haul that car down our street. I did it because I believed I was investing in the character of a good man. Now that same man was standing on the other end of a phone line eagerly assisting a fraudster in stealing the very house he grew up in. The sharp sting of disappointment slowly transformed into something entirely different. It turned into a cold, hardened resolve. The father who sold his dream car to pay for his son's education died the moment Eric signed that eviction notice. The man holding the phone right now was someone else entirely. I interrupted Eric's frantic rambling. I kept my voice perfectly flat and compliant. I told him I understood. I agreed to meet him and Natalie at the coffee shop on 5th Avenue in exactly 1 hour. I promised to sign whatever they needed to finalize the process. I heard an audible sigh of relief escape Eric's lips. He told me to hurry and hung up the phone without saying goodbye. I stood up from the sagging mattress. I smoothed the wrinkles from my denim jacket. I opened my phone again and dialed Michael Rhodes. He answered immediately. I told Michael that Natalie was moving faster than we anticipated. She wanted me to sign a waiver releasing my claim to the property. Michael warned me that signing their documents would give them full legal authority to leverage the house for their criminal loan. I smiled a cold, humorless smile. I told Michael I had absolutely no intention of signing their paperwork. I instructed Michael to draft a very specific legal document immediately. I needed a formal notice of a property dispute that could sit inside the same kind of dense paperwork Natalie expected to see. The document had to state clearly that I remained the recorded owner, disputed any attempted transfer, and refused consent to any mortgage or encumbrance. Once I signed it, and Natalie delivered it with her loan package, the title processor and lenders would have actual written notice that the collateral was contested. That notice would force them to stop the transaction until ownership was resolved. It was a financial landmine disguised as a white flag. Michael understood the strategy instantly. He told me his legal team would draft the trap in 10 minutes. He promised to have a courier deliver the document to me right outside the coffee shop before I walked in. I thanked Michael and ended the call. I walked toward the narrow staircase leading out of the damp basement. Natalie and Eric believed they were summoning a helpless old man to surrender the last piece of his dignity. They thought they had backed me into a corner. They had no idea I was bringing a lock and a chain to trap them inside it. I climbed the wooden stairs, stepping out into the bright afternoon sunlight, ready to hand them the very rope they would use to hang themselves. I arrived at the coffee shop on 5th Avenue 20 minutes early, dressed exactly as Natalie expected to see me: faded denim jacket, worn work boots, shoulders slightly rounded. Michael had prepared 2 identical copies of a document titled Waiver and Acknowledgement of Property Interest. The title was deliberately ordinary. The operative language was not. Buried in the middle of the document was a formal notice that I disputed any transfer of ownership, denied consent to any mortgage or encumbrance, and reserved every right I held as the recorded owner. A lender that received the signed notice would have actual knowledge that the title was contested. That alone was enough to stop any responsible underwriting process until the dispute was resolved. Michael had kept the second signed counterpart at his office. I carried the matching original Natalie would expect to take away. I did not need her to file it for me. I only needed her to deliver my written notice directly into the hands of the people she was trying to borrow from. When Natalie and Eric entered the coffee shop, she moved through the room as if the furniture belonged to her. She wore a black designer dress and carried the same expensive handbag she had brought to my house. Eric followed one step behind. His eyes went everywhere except toward me. Natalie reached the booth and dropped a stack of papers on the table. She did not sit. She told me the documents were a standard release required by the supposed cash buyer. She spoke slowly, loudly, and with the exaggerated patience people use when they want an older person to feel incompetent. According to her, all I had to do was sign and disappear from the title forever. I let my hands rest on the table. Then I made them tremble. Eric finally looked at me. For a second, his face changed. I saw embarrassment, maybe even shame. It vanished the moment Natalie glanced at him. "Just sign it, Dad," he muttered. "This is easier for everyone." The sentence brought back a memory I did not want. 12 years earlier, Eric had sat at our kitchen table holding his university acceptance letter. I had walked into the garage that afternoon and looked at the 1969 Ford Mustang I had rebuilt over 8 years. I sold it the next morning and paid his first year of tuition without telling him what it cost me emotionally. I had believed sacrifice created gratitude. Standing in that coffee shop, I understood that sacrifice without accountability could create the opposite. I reached into my jacket for a cheap plastic pen. I let it slip from my fingers. It rolled off the edge of the table and stopped beside Natalie's shoe. She exhaled loudly and stepped back as if I had dropped something filthy near her. Eric bent down to retrieve it. In that 2-second distraction, I slid Natalie's actual waiver beneath the folder beside me and placed Michael's prepared notice exactly where it had been. The paper stock spacing and heading were similar enough that a person who only cared about the signature line would see what she expected to see. Eric handed the pen back. I held it with an unsteady grip and looked down at the document. The first paragraph used the language of surrender Natalie wanted. The controlling paragraphs beneath it did the opposite. They stated that ownership remained disputed, that I did not authorize any lien mortgage deed of trust or power of attorney against the property, and that any person receiving the document was on written notice of my adverse claim. I signed. The moment the ink touched the final stroke, Natalie snatched the document away. She did not read a single paragraph. She looked only at my name at the bottom and smiled. "Finally," she said. She folded the document and slid it into her handbag. Then she told me to enjoy the basement because the house would be gone by the end of the week. Eric remained beside the table for 1 second longer. His mouth opened as if he wanted to say something. Nothing came out. He followed his wife toward the door. I stayed in the booth and watched them leave. Michael did not need a notary standing beside me. He did not need to invent a court filing after the fact. His office already held the duplicate counterpart and the recorded deed proving my ownership. The trap depended on something similar. Natalie herself was about to deliver a signed notice of dispute to the title company and the private lenders, while insisting it was a clean waiver. The second they read beyond the heading, they would know the collateral was poisoned. 15 minutes later, Michael called. His office had received a scanned copy from the title processor because the document contradicted everything Natalie had represented in the loan package. Michael immediately sent the processor the recorded deed and the duplicate counterpart from his file. The property was flagged as contested and non-consensual collateral. No legitimate lender would touch it. More importantly, even the predatory private lenders Natalie had approached would not advance money against a house they could not seize cleanly. I thanked Michael and ended the call. Natalie thought she had tricked a confused mechanic into surrendering his last asset. In reality, she had carried the warning label directly to the people she was trying to deceive. By the time I finished my coffee, the title was effectively frozen for lending purposes until the dispute could be resolved. Natalie had wanted my signature more than she wanted to understand what she was asking me to sign. That impatience had just destroyed the only collateral keeping her financial scheme alive. I buttoned my worn jacket and walked back toward the basement apartment she had chosen for me. I did not have to chase her. She was already running toward the trap. What made the trap work was not magic language or a loophole hidden in a clever contract. It was Natalie's own impatience. She had spent weeks telling lenders that the property was uncontested and that I had voluntarily stepped aside. My signed notice directly contradicted that story. The title processor could not simply ignore a recorded owner stating in writing that he rejected any mortgage or transfer. The private lenders could not pretend they had never been warned. Once they possessed actual notice, any attempt to treat the house as clean collateral carried the risk of a title fight they could not win quickly. Michael had warned me not to think of the document as a permanent curse on the house. No paper could freeze real estate forever by itself. But it did not have to. It only had to destroy Natalie's timetable. Her creditors wanted fast, liquid collateral. A contested house was useless to them until the ownership issue was resolved, and she did not have months to wait. That was the point. For the first time since the wedding, I was not reacting to her demands. I was controlling the clock. The basement would still smell like mildew when I returned. Natalie would still believe she had reduced me to a man with one suitcase and no leverage. I was willing to let her keep that illusion for a few more hours, because arrogance made her careless. The more certain she became that I was weak, the more openly she exposed what she was willing to do. I slipped my hands into the pockets of my old jacket and stepped into the afternoon crowd. Somewhere across the city, Natalie was presenting my signature as proof of surrender. By nightfall, she would learn it was proof of the exact opposite. I woke up to the sound of water dripping into a rusted metal sink. The damp cold of the cellar seeped deeply into my bones, but my mind was entirely sharp. I sat on the edge of the thin mattress, drinking a cup of instant coffee I had made using a cheap, portable hot plate. I knew the major financial institutions in the city opened their heavy glass doors at exactly 8 in the morning. I knew that the county clerk office updated their automated property registries at the exact same time. Natalie was likely sitting in a plush leather chair in some high-end lending office, expecting to walk out with $1 million in illicit cash. Instead, she was about to face the devastating reality of the legal landmine I had planted deep inside her designer handbag. The heavy wooden door at the top of the basement stairs did not just open. It was violently kicked off its hinges. The loud crash echoed through the confined space, followed immediately by the frantic clicking of high heels descending the wooden steps at a dangerous and reckless speed. I did not flinch or jump. I took another slow sip of my bitter coffee and waited patiently in the dim light. Natalie stormed into the center of the small concrete room. Her pristine appearance from the previous day was completely gone. Her expensive hair was disheveled, and her face was flushed with absolute uncontrollable rage. Her breath came in heavy, erratic gasps, making her look exactly like a cornered predator. She screamed at the top of her lungs, demanding to know what kind of sick trick I had played on her. She paced frantically across the concrete floor, kicking a small wooden stool out of her way. The stool slammed hard into the concrete wall and splintered into sharp pieces. She told me she had just come from the shadow lending office. When she presented the waiver document to the syndicate, their financial analysts ran a standard background sweep on the property. The system immediately flagged the house with a severe and active legal dispute. The syndicate realized they could not legally seize the house if she defaulted on her payments. They completely rejected her $1 million cash request and threw her out of their office into the street. Natalie completely lost her mind. She grabbed a ceramic mug resting on the small bedside table and hurled it violently at the rusted sink. It shattered into dozens of sharp fragments, sending cold coffee splattering across the dusty floor. She screamed that I had ruined her entire life and completely destroyed her future. She claimed I was nothing but a worthless and pathetic mechanic who had no right to interfere with her massive financial ambitions. She demanded that I march down to the county clerk office right this second and officially retract the property dispute. I sat perfectly still on the sagging mattress, watching her unravel before my eyes. Her absolute desperation confirmed everything Michael had uncovered in his financial investigation. She was entirely out of money, out of time, and completely out of options. I noticed that Eric was nowhere to be seen. He had not accompanied her to the basement. He was likely sitting upstairs in my living room, burying his head in his hands, avoiding any confrontation. He had allowed his new wife to storm into a dark cellar to harass and threaten his elderly father. The cowardice of my son deepened my resolve. I had spent decades trying to protect him from the harsh realities of the world. Now I was going to let the world teach him the hardest lesson of his life. When I refused to respond to her frantic and demanding screams, her anger shifted into something much darker and far more sinister. She stepped closer to me, leaning over the edge of the mattress. The sweet and innocent facade she used to manipulate my son was completely stripped away. She lowered her voice to a vicious and trembling whisper. She told me that I had absolutely no idea who I was messing with. She bragged that she had deep connections to highly dangerous people in the city underworld. She threatened that if I did not fix the legal block on the title by the end of the week, she would make a single phone call to her associates. She promised that a group of violent thugs would drag me out of this basement, throw me into the back of an unmarked van, and dump my body in a ditch far outside the city limits. She vowed that Eric would never look for me, because she would simply convince him I had run away out of pure shame. I looked directly into her cold, calculating eyes and realized she was not making an empty threat. This woman was backed into a terrible corner and facing complete financial ruin. She was willing to cross every single legal and moral boundary to survive. She was fully prepared to resort to organized violence against her own father-in-law just to secure a payday. I knew that arguing with her or showing any defiance would only feed her twisted sense of power and alert her to my true strength. I lowered my head and let out a long, weary sigh, playing the role of a terrified old man who realized he had pushed a highly dangerous person too far. I told her in a shaky and weak voice that I needed time to contact a public defender to see if the legal document could be reversed. Natalie let out a harsh, triumphant laugh, thinking she had successfully terrified me into complete submission. She warned me that my time was running out and that I had better produce results immediately. She turned around and marched back up the wooden stairs, leaving a trail of broken ceramic and splintered wood in my temporary home. The heavy door slammed shut at the top of the landing, plunging the basement back into heavy silence. I looked down at the shattered pieces on the concrete floor. The game had just escalated from a simple real estate dispute to a matter of serious physical safety. Natalie had explicitly threatened me with organized violence and bodily harm. The problem was that I had absolutely no proof of her words. It was my word against hers, and Eric would undoubtedly take her side without hesitation. I knew exactly what needed to be done next. I needed ironclad and irrefutable evidence of her criminal behavior. I needed to catch her actively plotting her next illegal move. I reached into my denim jacket pocket and pulled out my mobile phone. It was time to install hidden eyes and ears inside my former home. I was going to let Natalie dig her own grave, and I was going to record every single shovelful of dirt. I sat in the heavy darkness of the basement apartment, staring at the glowing screen of my mobile phone. At exactly 7 in the evening, I watched from a dark corner across the street as Eric and Natalie left the house dressed for dinner. Their luxury rental vehicle disappeared toward downtown. I waited another 10 minutes to make sure they were not returning for something they had forgotten. Only then did I move. It was the quiet window of opportunity I had been waiting for. I stood up from the sagging mattress and pulled a heavy black canvas duffel bag from the darkest corner of the cellar. The bag did not contain the heavy wrenches or greasy spark plugs I had used for the past 40 years. It was packed with state-of-the-art micro-surveillance equipment that Michael had procured through a highly classified private security firm. I slipped out of the damp basement, pulling the collar of my faded denim jacket up against the chill of the evening wind. I walked the familiar 2-mile route back to my own property, moving silently under the cover of night. The neighborhood was entirely quiet, with only the soft glow of street lamps illuminating the manicured lawns. I walked up my own driveway, sticking carefully to the deep shadows cast by the large oak trees. Natalie had arrogantly demanded the front door keys, but she was completely oblivious to the hidden electronic keypad lock I had installed on the side door of the garage more than 10 years ago. Diana and I had put it there for the times we accidentally locked ourselves out during our late-night walks. I reached the door and punched in the 5-digit code. It was the date of our wedding anniversary. The heavy reinforced door clicked open with a soft mechanical sigh. I stepped over the threshold and closed the door securely behind me, plunging myself into the familiar darkness of my own garage. Walking from the garage into the main house felt like entering an active crime scene. The air inside the living room smelled of an expensive and cloying citrus room spray, completely masking the comforting scents of motor oil and vanilla that had defined this home for decades. I did not allow myself to waste a single second getting sentimental or angry. I had exactly 2 hours before they finished their expensive dinner and drove back. I moved through the house with the precise and calculated efficiency of a master mechanic. I had spent my entire life wiring complex electrical systems, pulling apart classic car engines, and finding the absolute perfect way to route hidden cables. A house was no different than a vehicle. Both had blind spots, hollow cavities, and hidden channels that an untrained eye would never notice. I started my work in the main living room. I approached the fireplace mantel, where Natalie had callously knocked over Diana's photograph on the day of my eviction. I pulled a specialized silent drill from my duffel bag. I carefully removed the decorative casing of the wall sconce mounted high above the mantel. I hardwired a high-definition micro-camera directly into the electrical grid of the house, ensuring it would never run out of battery power. The camera lens was no larger than the head of a pin, but it offered a perfect sweeping panoramic view of the entire living area. I then embedded a highly sensitive directional microphone deep behind the wooden crown molding near the ceiling. It was calibrated to pick up even the faintest whisper from anywhere in the room. I moved methodically, planting tiny lenses inside the return air conditioning vents and hiding audio receivers behind the heavy wooden bookshelves in the hallway. When I stepped into the home office, a sudden and overwhelming wave of sharp memories hit my chest. This was the exact room where my late wife wrote the brilliant source code that eventually made us a staggering fortune. I remembered bringing Diana cups of black coffee at 2 in the morning, rubbing her tired shoulders while she stared intensely at lines of complex data on a glowing monitor. She had built a revolutionary cybersecurity protocol through relentless, grueling labor. We hid our wealth to ensure Eric would grow up understanding the absolute value of hard work. Now Natalie was sitting in this exact same office plotting to steal our legacy, using nothing but vicious lies and an unearned marriage certificate. I tightened the final screw on a camera hidden perfectly inside the plastic casing of the smoke detector above the desk. My momentary grief was completely eradicated and replaced by a cold, mechanical focus. I was wiring an inescapable trap that would catch them in the absolute worst act of their lives. I synchronized the entire surveillance network to a secure encrypted server that could only be accessed through my personal phone. I wiped down every single surface I touched with a microfiber cloth, ensuring not a single speck of dust or fingerprint was left out of place. I slipped back out through the garage side door, locking it securely behind me, just as a light, freezing rain began to fall over the city. I walked the 2 miles back to the miserable basement cellar, feeling infinitely more powerful than I had in weeks. I sat down on the cold mattress and opened the custom application on my phone. The screen flickered briefly before splitting into 4 crystal-clear, high-definition video feeds. The audio was perfectly crisp, picking up the ambient hum of the refrigerator in the empty kitchen. The system was flawless. Exactly. 45 minutes later, the front door of my house swung violently open on the video feed. Natalie stormed into the living room looking absolutely furious. She threw her expensive leather handbag onto the sofa and began pacing aggressively across the hardwood floor. Eric trailed in behind her, looking utterly exhausted and terrified. I turned up the volume on my phone, listening intently as their conversation unfolded. Natalie screamed that her secondary loan application had been officially and permanently rejected by the banks. She yelled that her creditors were breathing down her neck and that they were completely out of time and out of legal options. Eric pleaded with her to calm down. He suggested they simply sell his leased luxury car to cover the immediate debt and buy them some breathing room. Natalie turned on him with a vicious, sneering laugh. She told him that selling his pathetic car would not even cover the weekly interest on what she owed the black market shadow syndicate. She marched over to the dining table and pulled a fresh stack of crisp legal documents from her bag. I zoomed the hidden camera in on the papers resting on the wood. Natalie slammed her hand down on this table and declared that they were moving to her absolute final contingency plan. She looked directly at my trembling son and commanded him to sit down at the table. She pulled a pen from her pocket and placed it on top of the documents. Natalie announced that they were going to bypass the legitimate banks entirely. She ordered Eric to forge my exact signature on a brand new blank power of attorney form. She explained with chilling calmness that they were going to use my forged signature to take out a massive illegal cash loan from the most dangerous criminals in the entire city. Eric stared at the pen, his hands shaking visibly on the camera feed. He stammered that forging a legal document was a major federal crime. Natalie leaned over him, her voice dropping to a sinister, manipulative whisper. She told him that if he did not forge his father's signature tonight, she would be killed by her creditors, and he would spend the rest of his life paying off her debt. I watched my screen, holding my breath, as Eric slowly reached out and picked up the pen, preparing to cross the ultimate point of no return. The harsh blue light of my mobile phone illuminated the damp concrete walls of my basement cellar. I sat perfectly still on the edge of the rusted spring mattress, watching the live video feed stream directly from my former living room. Eric held a black ink pen suspended inches above a thick legal document resting on my dining room table. Natalie hovered over him like a predatory bird circling a wounded animal. She slammed her hand flat against the polished wood, demanding he stop acting like an absolute coward. She told him that the Shadow Syndicate would front them $1 million in cash by the end of the week if they provided this specific power of attorney. She lied smoothly, claiming they would easily pay the illegal money back before anyone even noticed it was missing. Eric wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead. He stammered that forging a signature on a major financial document was a severe federal felony. He warned her that if the title company or the lenders looked too closely, they could both face decades in federal prison. Natalie leaned down and whispered directly into his ear. The directional microphone I had hidden behind the crown molding picked up every single chilling syllable. She told him that if they did not secure this cash, the ruthless men she owed money to would not bother calling the police. They would simply break into this house and take their payment in blood. She manipulated his fear perfectly, wrapping her financial crimes in a blanket of physical danger. I watched the screen, holding my breath. I waited to see if my son had even a shred of moral integrity left inside him. Eric stared at the blank signature line. His hand shook violently. He lowered the pen and pressed the ballpoint firmly against the paper. I watched in absolute silence as my son meticulously forged my name. He copied the exact slant of my cursive handwriting and the specific way I looped my capital letters. It was a signature I had used to sign his elementary school permission slips, his first medical release forms, and the loan for his first reliable car. Now he was deliberately weaponizing my name to steal my property and fund his wife's massive criminal debts. The sight of the blue ink bleeding into the paper severed a thick cord deep inside my chest. I remembered standing in our driveway, holding a 10-year-old Eric by the shoulders after he broke a neighbor's window and cowardly tried to blame it on another child. Diana and I had marched him right up to the neighbor's porch and made him look the man in the eye to apologize. We taught him that a real man is defined by his accountability and his honesty. We poured our hearts into raising a man of honor. But looking at the digital screen, I realized that innocent boy was completely gone. The man sitting at my dining table was not a confused victim of a manipulative woman. He was a willing and active participant in a massive criminal conspiracy. My paternal obligation to protect my son officially ended the exact moment he finished forging the final letter of my name. Natalie snatched the paper off the table the second Eric lifted the pen. She examined the forged signature with a massive, victorious smile, holding the document up to the light. She told Eric he had finally acted like a real man and solved all their problems. She carefully placed the fraudulent power of attorney inside a pristine manila envelope, sealing it shut. She announced that she was taking the document straight to her contacts in the Shadow Syndicate the very next morning. She bragged that they were going to secure the $1 million in unmarked cash, pay off her aggressive creditors, and leave all their miserable problems far behind them. She poured 2 glasses of expensive red wine to celebrate their felony, completely unaware that she was raising a toast on a stage I fully controlled. A normal man would have immediately dialed emergency services. A normal father would have forwarded the high-definition video directly to the authorities and let the detectives kick the front door down before dawn. But immediately handing the recording to investigators would end the financial trail before I understood who controlled Natalie's debts and how far the scheme reached. I wanted the full structure exposed before anyone had the chance to destroy evidence or invent another story. They wanted to play ruthless games with black market lenders and violent syndicates. I was going to give them a front-row seat to the exact nightmare they were begging for. I tapped the screen of my phone, saving the encrypted video file directly to my highly secured cloud server. I packed my few belongings into my heavy canvas duffel bag and zipped it shut. I left the damp basement cellar and walked through the dark, freezing city streets until I reached the towering glass building of Rhodes Financial. It was 3 in the morning, but Michael Rhodes was already sitting in his massive executive office waiting for my arrival. I walked in and placed my phone directly on his polished mahogany desk. I pressed play and let Michael watch the crystal-clear video of the forgery. Michael watched the video twice without interrupting. When it ended, he looked at the forged power of attorney and said the recording was strong evidence of a deliberate fraud scheme. He reached toward his phone. I stopped him. Not tonight. I was not asking him to bury evidence or obstruct an investigation. I wanted the original file preserved, copied, and protected while we understood the financial network Natalie was using. She had threatened me, manipulated Eric into forging my name, and was trying to borrow from private lenders operating through layers of shell companies. If we moved too early, the people behind those notes could disappear, and Natalie would simply claim she had been bluffing. I told Michael to trace every documented obligation tied to her. He warned me that the lenders surrounding Natalie mixed legitimate-looking promissory notes with predatory and sometimes illegal collection methods. We could not purchase threats or inherit the right to intimidate her. But if the written debts were assignable, a lawful holding company could buy the notes and servicing rights from anyone willing to sell. Then buy the paper, I said, not the violence. The pending $1 million application was still unfunded. I did not want Michael to approve it or hand Natalie cash. I wanted him to acquire the existing debt portfolio and, if possible, the servicing relationship connected to the pending application. Then we could decide whether the new advance lived or died. Most important, Natalie would not know who stood behind the buyer. Michael nodded. He encrypted the forgery video, copied it to his firm's evidence vault, and began preparing the acquisition vehicle. I left the office before dawn. Natalie believed the most dangerous people in her life were the lenders she had chosen. By the time she woke up, those people would be looking for a buyer. And I had more than enough money to make them stop looking. He also warned me that control of the debt would not make me a prosecutor, a judge, or a criminal collector. Any enforcement had to remain on the lawful side of the line Natalie was crossing so eagerly. That was exactly what I wanted. The punishment would come from her own signed obligations, her own forged documents, and her own panic. I did not need to invent a crime for her. I only needed to stop protecting her from the ones she was already committing. Michael and I met before sunrise in his office. The video of Eric forging my signature was already stored on the encrypted server, but I did not ask him to call the police yet. Natalie had made it clear that her life revolved around debt. If I wanted to understand the full structure behind her, I needed control of the paper she had signed long before she ever met my son. Michael explained that the so-called Shadow Syndicate was not one simple street gang. It used a chain of private lending companies, shell entities, and aggressive collection contractors. Some of its behavior was plainly unlawful, but the money itself was documented through promissory notes and assignment agreements. Those written obligations could be purchased like other distressed debt, even if the methods surrounding them were predatory. That distinction mattered. I authorized Michael to create a special-purpose holding company and make the lenders an offer they would not refuse immediate cash at a premium in exchange for every documented note, guarantee, and servicing right tied to Natalie. We were not buying threats. We were buying the paper that gave the lenders a financial claim. Michael made the calls through counsel and intermediaries. He never mentioned my name. The response came quickly. Natalie's creditors were far less loyal to her than she imagined. Once they saw a buyer willing to pay them more than the face value of the debt, without delay, they stopped caring about her future. They assigned the notes and walked away with their profit. The new holder was Diana Legacy Holdings. Mine. Michael placed the executed assignment documents on the desk between us. For the first time, every written private debt Natalie had been running from pointed toward a company I controlled. The pending $1 million advance was different. It had not been funded. Michael arranged for the servicing rights and the application file to move with the same portfolio so that our side could review the proposed new loan. We did not approve it, and we did not cancel it immediately. We left it under review. That uncertainty was the bait. Natalie received notice that her old creditors had transferred the portfolio and that collection activity was temporarily paused while the new holder reviewed the accounts. She mistook the pause for salvation. She assumed the pending $1 million advance was still coming. From the basement, I watched the cameras in my house. Natalie stood in my living room holding one of Diana's crystal wine glasses and told Eric that a miracle had happened. She said the dangerous people she owed had suddenly backed off and that a new financial group was taking over. She praised Eric for forging my signature and declared that their problems were almost over. Eric asked whether the money had actually arrived. Natalie waved the question away. She told him the transfer was only a technical delay and ordered him to stop thinking like his poor mechanic father. Then she announced that they were going to celebrate before the funds even cleared. She wanted a party. Not a small dinner, a public victory lap. She ordered premium catering cases of imported liquor, valet service floral arrangements, and a guest list filled with the wealthy people she had spent years trying to impress. Eric reminded her that his credit cards were already near their limits. Natalie told him to use whatever remained and promised the $1 million advance would erase everything. I watched her drink from Diana's glass while spending money she did not have against a loan she was never going to receive. The image should have made me furious. Instead, it made the next move simple. Natalie wanted witnesses to her success. I would give her witnesses to the truth. Michael warned me about one thing before I left his office. Owning the paper did not give us the right to imitate the criminals who had originally held it. We could not threaten Natalie C's property without process or reach into her bank accounts by simple command. If we enforced the debt, we would do it through documented assignments, formal notices, and the courts. I agreed immediately. The point was never to become the people she had chosen to deal with. The point was to remove those people from the board and replace chaos with control. That difference was invisible to Natalie. All she saw was silence from the men who had been pressuring her. She interpreted silence the same way she interpreted mine, as weakness, fear, or surrender. She had no idea that every note had changed hands and that the person on the other side of her debt now knew exactly how she had tried to use my house, my son's credit, and my forged signature. When she announced the party, Michael asked if I wanted him to stop the spending by freezing Eric's remaining cards. I told him no. Those cards belonged to Eric, and Eric was still choosing to use them. I would not manufacture another trap where none was needed. Their own decisions were enough. The party itself would create the next pressure point. Natalie would invite business contacts, lenders, friends, and people whose opinions mattered to her. She would surround herself with the audience she valued most. If the truth surfaced there, she could not later rewrite the scene as a private family dispute. I closed the surveillance application and stared at the cracked concrete wall of the basement. She thought the pause in collection meant the storm had passed. In reality, the storm had changed direction. The walk from the basement cellar was bitterly cold. The city streets were slick with freezing rain. I walked with a steady and deliberate pace. I did not wear a tailored suit or a silk tie. I wore the exact same heavy canvas coveralls I had worn in my garage for the last 20 years. The fabric was permanently stained with dark motor oil and engine grease. My heavy steel-toed work boots echoed against the wet pavement. I was walking toward my own home to attend a celebration I had never been invited to. When I reached my street, the sight before me was absolutely absurd. Natalie had completely taken over the neighborhood. A line of expensive luxury cars stretched all the way down the block. Valet attendants in crisp white shirts were running back and forth, grabbing keys and parking vehicles on my front lawn. A massive catering van was parked illegally, blocking the fire hydrant. Natalie was spending thousands of dollars. She did not actually have to impress people who did not actually care about her. I walked straight up my own driveway. A young valet attendant tried to step in front of me and raise his hand. He took one look at my grease-stained coveralls and my hardened expression and decided to step back out of my way. He assumed I was a late working plumber or a maintenance worker called in to fix an emergency leak. He had no idea I was the man who legally owned the ground he was standing on. I pushed the heavy oak front door open and stepped into the grand foyer. The transformation of my home was physically sickening. Natalie had hired decorators to drape cheap synthetic silk over my antique wooden furniture. She had completely removed all the framed photographs of my late wife, Diana, and replaced them with massive, arrogant portraits of herself and Eric. The air smelled of expensive catered seafood and imported floral arrangements. The subtle, comforting scent of vanilla that always lingered in these halls was entirely eradicated. A live string quartet was playing classical music in the corner of the dining room. Waiters in black vests circulated through the crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with crystal champagne flutes. The house was packed with dozens of shallow, arrogant guests. They wore expensive designer gowns and custom-tailored suits. They stood in small circles, laughing loudly and boasting about their latest vacations and business acquisitions. They were the exact type of people Natalie desperately wanted to be. They were superficial vultures, attracted to the illusion of massive wealth. I did not try to blend in or hide in the shadows. I walked directly into the center of the main living room. My heavy boots thumped loudly against the polished hardwood floor, leaving faint traces of damp street dirt in my wake. I stood under the bright chandelier, crossing my arms over my chest, and waited. A woman in a shimmering silver dress was the first to notice me. She was lifting a champagne flute to her lips when she caught sight of my grease-stained coveralls. She gasped loudly and took a stumbling step backward, spilling her expensive drink down the front of her dress. The man standing next to her turned his head, and his jaw dropped in absolute shock. The reaction spread through the crowded room like a shockwave. One by one, the wealthy guests stopped talking. They lowered their crystal glasses and stared at me in complete horror. The lively chatter and arrogant boasting faded into a confused and heavy silence. The musicians in the string quartet noticed the sudden shift in the room. The cellist faltered, missing a note, and the music ground to an awkward and agonizing halt. The only sound left in my entire house was the soft hum of the central heating system. The sea of tailored suits and designer dresses slowly parted, creating a wide, empty circle around me as if I were carrying a highly contagious disease. Natalie was standing by the fireplace mantel, basking in the attention of three wealthy investors. She wore a stunning crimson gown that must have cost more than a reliable used car. She had a diamond necklace resting against her collarbone and a look of absolute supreme arrogance on her face. When the music stopped, she turned around with a highly irritated expression, ready to scold the musicians. Her eyes scanned the parted crowd and landed directly on me. The smug and victorious smile vanished from her face in a fraction of a second. All the color drained from her cheeks, leaving her looking like a terrified ghost. Her hand trembled so violently that the champagne in her crystal glass spilled over the rim and dripped onto her expensive crimson gown. For one glorious and extended moment, she was completely speechless. Eric was standing just a few feet away from her, holding a plate of catered food. He took one look at my heavy boots and my stained coveralls and immediately lowered his head. He took a slow, cowardly step backward, trying to hide behind a group of tall guests. He was the man of the house, the supposed master of this new wealthy domain, and he could not even muster the courage to look his own father in the eye. The shock on Natalie's face rapidly morphed into a vicious and uncontrollable rage. The veins in her neck bulged as she handed her spilled champagne glass to a confused guest. She marched across the hardwood floor, her high heels clicking sharply in the dead silence of the room. She closed the distance between us, stopping just a few inches from my chest. She did not bother to maintain her sweet and innocent facade in front of her high society friends. She lowered her voice to a venomous and trembling hiss, demanding to know how I had gotten past the valet staff outside. She ordered me to turn around and walk out the front door immediately before she had me arrested for criminal trespassing. She told me I was a filthy and disgusting old man who had no right to ruin the most important night of her entire life. I looked down at her flushed and furious face. I did not raise my voice. I did not move a single muscle. I kept my posture perfectly straight and my expression completely unreadable. I calmly informed her that I had every right to stand in the exact center of my own living room. I told her I had simply come to see the lavish celebration she was hosting. I slowly looked around the room, making deliberate eye contact with her wealthy friends. I stated clearly and calmly that it was quite an impressive party, considering she was completely bankrupt and drowning in massive criminal debt. Several guests standing nearby overheard my calm statement. A collective gasp rippled through the front row of the crowd. People began whispering frantically to each other, pointing fingers and exchanging highly suspicious glances. Natalie heard the whispers, and her eyes widened in absolute sheer panic. Her carefully constructed illusion of immense wealth and power was cracking wide open right in front of the very people she was trying to manipulate. She realized she could not intimidate me with quiet threats. She needed to remove me from the room by absolute brute force before I completely destroyed her reputation. She spun around and faced the crowd. She raised her voice, projecting a tone of fake victimhood and dramatic terror. She announced to the room that I was a deeply disturbed and mentally unstable old man who had been harassing her and her husband for weeks. She claimed I was completely delusional and dangerous. She snapped her fingers aggressively in the air and screamed for the private security team she had hired for the evening. Two massive men wearing tight black suits pushed their way through the crowd of terrified guests. They looked highly professional and extremely intimidating. Natalie pointed a trembling finger directly at my chest. She commanded the security guards to grab me by the arms and physically throw me out into the freezing street. She ordered them to use whatever force was necessary to remove the filthy mechanic from her beautiful home. The guests instinctively pulled back, widening the empty circle around me. Natalie remained beneath the chandelier with one finger pointed at my chest, as if she were passing sentence. I could hear the guards approaching through the crowd, their shoes striking the hardwood. I slid one hand inside my coveralls and touched the folded legal packet Michael had prepared. The next move would decide who actually had authority inside the house. The two security guards moved toward me through the silent circle of guests. Natalie stood behind them with her arms folded, wearing the satisfied expression of someone who believed she had finally turned humiliation into force. I did not step back. Before the lead guard could touch my coveralls, I reached inside my jacket and removed a thick legal packet. I held it out at chest level. "Read the first page before you put your hands on me." He hesitated, then took it. The document was not inside my jacket and removed a thick legal packet. I held it out at chest level. "Read the first page before you put your hands on me." He hesitated, then took it. The document was not a theatrical prop. Earlier that afternoon, Michael had obtained an emergency court order based on the recorded deed, the false possession demands, and Natalie's threat to use violence if I did not remove the title dispute. The order confirmed that I remained the sole recorded owner of the property and prohibited Natalie from entering, occupying, or directing others to control the house without my permission while the fraud allegations were being reviewed. The guard read the ownership record first. His posture changed. Then he reached the injunction. He looked at me, then at Natalie, and took a deliberate step backward. His partner followed. Natalie's smile vanished. "What are you doing?" she snapped. "I hired you. Throw him out." The lead guard kept the papers in both hands. His voice was careful when he answered. "Ma'am, these documents identify Mr. Sullivan as the recorded owner. They also contain an active order restricting your access to the property. We cannot remove him for you." The room reacted before Natalie did. Whispers moved through the guests. A woman near the fireplace lowered her champagne glass. Two men who had been laughing with Eric minutes earlier quietly stepped away from him. Natalie lunged toward the guard and demanded the papers. He did not give them to her. She turned toward the staircase and screamed for Peterson. Her lawyer had been standing near the edge of the crowd with a drink in his hand. When he heard his name, the color left his face. He set the glass down and approached slowly. I removed a second copy of the legal packet and handed it to him. Peterson read faster than the guard had. The first page established title. The second documented the false claim that Eric and Natalie owned the house. The next pages included Michael's reconstruction of the loan application. The disputed property notice Natalie had delivered to the lenders and the sworn account of her threat against me in the basement. The final page advised that the court had preserved the property while the underlying fraud was investigated. Peterson's jaw tightened. I understood what Natalie had apparently never considered. The paper he served at my door was not a judge-signed eviction order. It was a private demand drafted from information his client supplied. He had treated her representations as fact without verifying the recorded deed. That mistake alone was serious. The possibility that she had used him as part of a fraudulent property scheme was much worse. Natalie grabbed his arm. "Tell them this is fake." Peterson pulled away. He reread the signature block and the filing stamp on the emergency order. Then he looked directly at her. "I can't tell them that." Her face hardened. "I pay you to represent me." "You paid me to represent lawful interests," he said. "You did not pay me to validate a false ownership claim." A murmur moved through the party. Natalie heard it and lost control. She accused Peterson of cowardice. She accused me of buying the court. She told the guards that the house belonged to Eric because he was my son and because I had already agreed to leave. I answered for the first time. "Being my son did not transfer my deed." The sentence landed harder than a shout. I looked around the room and let the guests see the contrast Natalie had tried to hide. I was standing in grease-stained coveralls, but the recorded ownership was mine. She was wearing diamonds, but the court order said she had no right to occupy the house she was using as a stage. Natalie pointed toward the front door and demanded that Peterson call the police. He did not move. Instead, he closed the legal packet. "I am withdrawing from any further effort to remove Mr. Sullivan from this property," he said, "and I need independent counsel before I discuss anything else connected to these filings." He stepped away from Natalie, but he did not leave the house. He moved toward the grand staircase and remained there watching the room with the rigid expression of a man who had just realized his own client might have exposed him to criminal liability. That detail mattered later. For now, Natalie was focused entirely on me. Her expensive party had changed shape around her. The guards no longer obeyed her. Her lawyer would not defend the ownership claim. Her guests had stopped seeing me as the embarrassing mechanic and started seeing her as a woman celebrating inside a house she did not own. She tried one final performance. She raised her voice and told everyone the order was temporary. She claimed I had exploited a technicality because I was jealous of Eric's marriage. She said the entire dispute would be cleared up by morning when her financing closed. I smiled. Then you should have nothing to worry about. The calmness frightened her more than anger would have. She looked toward Eric. He was standing near the hallway, pale and silent. For a moment, I thought he might finally understand what was happening. He had watched his wife order guards to assault his father inside the father's own home. He had watched a court order strip away her story in front of everyone. He had watched Peterson retreat from the legal fiction he helped create. Still, Eric did not step toward me. He stepped toward Natalie. That choice opened the next conflict. He crossed the room, quickly caught my arm, and whispered that he needed to speak with me alone. I allowed him to lead me into the dim hallway beside the living room. Behind us, Natalie remained under the chandelier, with dozens of people watching her power disappear. Ahead of me, my son was about to learn that ownership was not the most damaging evidence I had brought into the house. The shift in the room was not dramatic because I had suddenly changed clothes or raised my voice. I was still the same 65-year-old mechanic Natalie had mocked when I walked in. What changed was the source of authority. 10 minutes earlier, everyone had assumed expensive fabric, and loud commands meant ownership. Now the people being paid to enforce Natalie's wishes had stopped taking orders from her because the law said the house belonged to me. One of the older guests asked Peterson whether Eric had ever been listed on the deed. Peterson did not answer immediately. That hesitation did more damage than any accusation I could have made. Natalie answered for him, insisting that family ownership was complicated and that Eric's interest came through inheritance. I knew there was no such inheritance. Diana's estate plan had never transferred this property to our son. Peterson knew it too, now that he had finally reviewed the recorded chain of title Michael attached to the packet. The guest asked again. Peterson said quietly, "I have not seen a recorded deed transferring this property to Eric." A few people near the dining room began gathering their coats. Natalie heard the movement and panicked. She told them not to leave. She claimed I had staged the entire dispute because I wanted attention. Her voice rose with every sentence until the polished confidence she had displayed when the party began was gone. I remained where I was. The temptation to reveal the $120 million crossed my mind for less than a second. I could have ended the argument by naming numbers companies and accounts, but that would have been the mistake she kept making. Real power did not need to dump every secret onto the floor at once. The house was enough. The court order was enough. Peterson's fear was enough. I wanted Natalie to understand that she was losing control without yet understanding how much control I actually possessed. The security chief handed the legal packet back to me. "Mr. Sullivan, do you want Ms. Sullivan removed now?" Every eye turned toward Natalie. She stiffened. I could have ended the party in that moment. The order allowed me to demand that she leave. Instead, I looked at the guests and then at my son. "Not yet." Natalie's eyes narrowed. I told the guards to remain nearby and prevent any physical interference with me or the property. I said there were still matters that needed to be clarified before anyone left. That decision terrified her because she could no longer predict my behavior. Peterson shifted closer to the staircase. He had stopped acting like a lawyer directing strategy and started acting like a witness trying to remember exactly what he had said and signed. Eric watched him. Then Eric looked at me. For the first time that night, the panic in his face was not about losing social status. It was about evidence. He knew what he had done at the dining room table. He knew whose name he had written. I saw the realization arrive before he reached for my arm. The property fight had just become a criminal one. The heavy silence in the grand living room was suddenly broken by the sound of rapid, desperate footsteps. Eric pushed his way through the crowd of stunned guests. His face was entirely pale, and his breathing was shallow and erratic. He reached out and grabbed my arm with a sweaty, trembling hand. His grip was remarkably weak for a man who claimed to be the new master of this estate. He did not say a word to the wealthy socialites staring at us. He simply pulled me away from the center of the room, dragging me into the dim light of the adjacent hallway. He wanted to hide. He wanted to escape the suffocating judgment of the people he had tried so desperately to impress. Eric pushed me into the secluded corridor and checked over his shoulder to ensure none of the guests had followed us. He turned back to me with wide, terrified eyes. He began to beg in a frantic and pathetic whisper. He pleaded with me to walk out the front door and disappear into the night. He claimed I was completely destroying his reputation and humiliating his wife in front of the most important investors in the city. He promised that if I just left right now, he would find a way to make things right tomorrow. He swore he would pay me back for the house and buy me a beautiful apartment anywhere I wanted. He was spinning a pathetic web of lies, completely incapable of facing the massive disaster he had helped create. I stood perfectly still in the quiet hallway, looking at the man I had raised from a boy. I searched his eyes for any lingering trace of honor or integrity. I looked for the son who had once proudly helped me rebuild classic car engines in the garage. I found absolutely nothing. The man standing in front of me was a hollow shell entirely consumed by greed and cowardice. He was willing to sacrifice his own father to protect a woman who viewed him as nothing more than a convenient financial tool. I felt a profound and hollow pity settle deep inside my chest. I did not raise my voice or interrupt his frantic pleading. I simply reached into the front pocket of my heavy canvas coveralls. I pulled out my mobile phone. The screen was already unlocked and loaded with the encrypted security application. I held the device up between us, illuminating the dark hallway with a harsh blue light. I tapped the center of the glass screen. A crystal-clear high-definition video began to play. Eric stopped talking immediately. His eyes locked onto the digital footage and all the remaining color drained from his face. The video showed my dining room table from just a few hours prior. It showed Eric sitting in the wooden chair, holding a black pen. It showed Natalie hovering over his shoulder, manipulating him with threats of violent creditors and black market shadow syndicates. The directional audio played perfectly through the small speaker of the phone. Natalie's venomous whispers echoed in the quiet hallway. Then the footage showed the exact, undeniable moment Eric pressed the pen to the paper and meticulously forged my signature on the fraudulent power of attorney document. Eric staggered backward as if he had been physically struck in the chest. His knees buckled slightly, and he leaned against the hallway wall to keep himself from collapsing to the floor. He began to shake uncontrollably. He stared at the glowing screen, unable to tear his eyes away from the undeniable evidence of his own severe federal crime. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a pathetic, choking sound came out. He tried to shake his head to deny the reality of the footage, but the blue light reflecting off his terrified face confirmed his absolute guilt. I lowered the phone and looked my son directly in the eyes. I kept my voice incredibly calm and perfectly flat. I told him that I knew absolutely everything. I listed the details with clinical precision. I told him about Natalie and her massive criminal debts. I told him about the violent shadow syndicate they were trying to borrow $1 million from. I told him that the legal document he forged was currently sitting inside Natalie designer handbag, acting as a financial landmine that was about to detonate their entire world. I watched the sheer terror consume his features. I offered him one absolute final choice. I told Eric that this was the ultimate crossroad of his entire life. I offered him a single lifeline out of the massive criminal conspiracy he had willingly walked into. I instructed him to turn around, walk back into the living room, and publicly announce that he was leaving Natalie forever. I told him to walk out the front door tonight and never look back. I promised him that if he finally did the right thing, I would use my resources to get him independent counsel document, his cooperation, and help him face the consequences, honestly, instead of letting Natalie drag him deeper. I offered him the chance to save his own soul. Eric stared at me with wide, unblinking eyes. He looked down the hallway toward the grand living room where Natalie was standing alone, surrounded by the whispers of her former friends. He looked back at the glowing screen of my mobile phone displaying the irrefutable proof of his felony. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. I waited patiently to see if the son Diana and I had raised would finally break through the cowardice. Panic and blind loyalty completely hijacked his logic. He did not see a father offering him salvation. He only saw a dangerous threat to his fragile and fake reality. Eric let out a desperate, animalistic gasp. He lunged forward with sudden, reckless speed. Before I could pull my hand away, he snatched the mobile phone directly from my grip. He held the device in his trembling hands, staring at the screen with absolute wild desperation. He did not say a word. He simply raised his arm, high above his head, and slammed the phone down onto the hard marble tile of the hallway floor. The device hit the stone with a loud, violent crack. Eric was not satisfied. He raised his expensive, custom-tailored dress shoe and stomped heavily on the device. He brought his heel down again and again, fueled by a blind, manic adrenaline. He crushed the plastic casing and ground the glass screen into dozens of tiny, shattered pieces. The harsh blue light flickered once and then died, completely plunging the hallway back into dim shadows. Eric took a heavy step backward, breathing rapidly. His chest heaved up and down as he stared at the destroyed pile of plastic and glass resting on the marble floor. He wiped a thick bead of sweat from his forehead and looked up at me. A twisted, arrogant smile slowly spread across his pale face. He pointed a shaking finger at the debris and whispered that it was completely over. He claimed that without that phone I had absolutely no proof of the forgery or the Shadow Syndicate. He bragged that he had just destroyed the only piece of evidence that could ever link him to a crime. He told me that he had just saved his wife and secured his future. He ordered me to turn around and walk out of his house immediately because I was now completely powerless. I looked down at the crushed phone resting on the cold tile. I did not flinch. I did not yell or express a single ounce of frustration. I slowly lifted my gaze back to my son. I felt a cold, absolute finality settle over my heart. Eric had made his choice. He had chosen the path of a criminal and a coward. He believed that smashing a physical piece of hardware would magically erase his sins. He had absolutely no comprehension of modern technology. He had no idea that the high-definition surveillance system I had installed in the house was directly hardwired into a secure, encrypted network. He did not know that the video file was never actually stored on the physical memory of that specific phone. The footage had been immediately uploaded and permanently locked inside a highly secured cloud server sitting on Michael Rhodes' desk across the city. Stomping on the phone was the equivalent of breaking a television screen and thinking you had destroyed the television station. Eric had not destroyed the evidence. He had simply destroyed his very last chance at redemption. I looked at the pathetic man standing before me and realized I no longer recognized a single part of him. He was a stranger who had just willingly locked the heavy steel door to his own prison cell. I gave him a slow, deliberate nod, acknowledging his blind and foolish choice. I turned my back on him without uttering another word, leaving him to stare at the broken glass on the floor, entirely unaware of the massive storm that was about to break over his head. I left Eric in the hallway with the broken remains of my phone at his feet. He did not follow me immediately. He stood there breathing hard, still trying to convince himself that shattered glass meant erased evidence. I knew better. The cloud server across the city already held every frame. When I stepped back into the living room, Natalie was forcing a smile for the guests. Peterson remained near the grand staircase after withdrawing from the property dispute. He had not. His briefcase was pressed against his leg, and he kept watching Natalie with the wary expression of a man beginning to understand that his client had told him only the version of events she needed him to believe. Natalie raised her voice and announced that the court order was nothing more than a temporary problem. She told her guests that a major private financial representative was arriving within minutes to complete a $1 million capital transaction. Once the funds cleared, she claimed every misunderstanding about the house would be resolved. She checked her watch. 3 minutes later, the front door opened. Michael Rhodes entered carrying a slim silver briefcase. He wore a dark navy suit, a white shirt, and the calm expression of someone who had no reason to rush. Several guests recognized him before Natalie did. Conversations stopped. People moved aside. Natalie's confidence returned instantly. She assumed he represented the private lending group handling her pending advance. She hurried toward him with both hands extended. "Mr. Rhodes, perfect timing." Michael did not take her hand. He stopped in the center of the room and introduced himself clearly. "Michael Rhodes, Rhodes Finance. I represent George Sullivan and the private holding company that now services the debt portfolio associated with your application." Natalie's hand lowered. She looked at me, then back at Michael. He opened his briefcase and removed the pending credit file. Natalie tried to speak first. She said the $1 million advance had already been approved in principle and that only a technical collateral issue remained. Michael corrected her. The loan had never been funded. The original private lenders had transferred their documented notes and servicing rights to a new holder. The pending advance had moved with the file for review. During that review, Michael's team examined the power of attorney Natalie submitted to support the transaction. He removed one page and held it up. It was the document bearing my forged signature. "The application is denied." The words were quiet. The effect was immediate. Natalie's mouth opened. Michael continued before she could interrupt. The power of attorney was inconsistent with the recorded ownership file. The lender had also received written notice that I disputed any transfer or encumbrance of the house. Most damaging of all, the signature on the power of attorney was now connected to video evidence showing how it had been created. Eric finally emerged from the hallway. He stopped near the staircase. Natalie saw him, but did not understand why he looked sick. She turned back to Michael and insisted the signature was valid. She accused me of planting false evidence because I wanted to ruin her marriage. Michael did not debate her. He placed the declined application on the coffee table. "Rhodes Financial is not making a moral judgment tonight. We are making a credit decision. The collateral is disputed. The authority document is compromised. No funds will be advanced." Several guests began whispering again. Natalie heard them. Her public victory party was collapsing one document at a time. She asked Michael whether another lender could still fund the deal. He told her any institution reviewing the same title and power of attorney package would face the same problems. That answer stripped away the last layer of composure. Natalie grabbed her phone. She scrolled frantically until she found the number of the broker who had managed her old private debts. She moved several steps away from Michael and pressed the phone to her ear. The call connected. At first, she tried to sound irritated instead of afraid. She said there had been a temporary complication with the collateral, but promised the $1 million advance would be resolved within 48 hours. Then she asked the broker to extend the existing payment deadline. The voice on the other end answered. I could not hear every word. I did not need to. Natalie's face changed. Her eyebrows tightened. Then her mouth went slack. "What do you mean, transferred?" The room grew quiet enough to hear her breathing. The broker explained that his group no longer owned the documented obligations. The promissory notes and servicing rights had been assigned to another entity in exchange for immediate payment. Any further discussion had to go through the new holder. Natalie demanded the name. The broker refused to discuss details beyond the formal assignment notice. She asked whether the pending $1 million advance was still available. The answer was no longer his to give. The call ended. Natalie stared at her screen as if the phone had betrayed her. For several seconds, she did not move. Michael watched without expression. I watched Eric. He had begun to understand that the broken phone in the hallway had changed nothing. Natalie called the broker again. No answer. She tried a second number. Voicemail. She turned toward Michael. You bought it. Michael did not confirm anything yet. He simply told her that a formal notice of assignment and enforcement had been prepared and would be delivered in accordance with the written debt instruments. The phrase, written debt instruments, mattered. Whatever illegal threats had surrounded Natalie's old lenders, Michael had not purchased the right to threaten her. He had purchased the documented financial claims those lenders were willing to assign. Natalie did not care about the distinction. All she understood was that the violent people she feared were no longer the people she owed. Someone else had taken their place. She looked around the party, suddenly aware that every expensive object surrounding her had been purchased while she was already drowning. Her champagne, her dress, the flowers, the valet service, the borrowed image of wealth. She had expected $1 million to arrive and erase the pressure. Instead, the loan was dead, and her existing debt had moved into the hands of an owner she could not identify. She clutched the phone tightly. Who owns it? Michael closed his briefcase. You'll have the answer in the next notice. I saw panic sharpen in her eyes. For the first time that night, Natalie was no longer trying to impress the room. She was trying to understand who controlled the floor beneath her. The answer was about to arrive with my signature on it. The significance of Michael's arrival was not lost on the people Natalie had invited. A few of the older investors recognized Rhodes Financial immediately. They knew his firm did not send its chief executive to a suburban party to celebrate a routine loan closing. His presence told them there was serious money somewhere in the room, but they had no idea whose money it was. One guest asked Natalie whether Rhodes Financial was backing her new venture. She said yes too quickly. Michael corrected her again. No, we are not financing Ms. Sullivan. The guest looked at me. Natalie noticed. That glance wounded her more than the rejected application. She had built the entire evening around the assumption that everyone would see me as the embarrassing old mechanic and her as the sophisticated new owner. Now the room was beginning to reverse those roles without me explaining a single detail about my fortune. Michael placed one more document on the table, a written preservation notice instructing all parties to retain the original loan file, the power of attorney, and every communication connected to the application. He explained that because the signature had been disputed, no one was to destroy, modify, or replace any supporting record. Eric heard that from the staircase. His hand went instinctively toward his pocket, then stopped. He finally understood why smashing my phone had been useless. The paper trail existed in more than one place. The video existed in more than one place. The more he tried to erase, the more obvious his panic became. Natalie did not look at him. She was too busy calculating her own survival. She asked Michael how long the review would take. It is finished. She asked whether she could submit different collateral. Not through this file. She asked whether a personal guarantee from Eric would change the decision. No. Each answer was shorter than the question. That rhythm broke her confidence piece by piece. She had spent weeks controlling conversations by speaking faster, louder, and more aggressively than everyone around her. Michael gave her nothing to fight. He simply closed every door she pointed toward. By the time she reached for her phone, she was no longer trying to negotiate. She was trying to escape. Michael did not make Natalie wait long for the answer. He removed a second folder from his briefcase and placed it on the coffee table. The cover page identified Diana Legacy Holdings as the current holder of the documented private debts that had previously been serviced by the lending group Natalie feared. She stared at the name. Then she stared at the signature beneath it. Mine. Her eyes moved slowly from the page to my work boots, then to the grease stains on my coveralls. For the first time since she entered my life, Natalie understood that the man she had treated as disposable possessed resources she had never imagined. I did not explain the full $120 million. Not yet. I explained only what mattered. Michael's company had purchased the assignable promissory notes and servicing rights connected to her existing private debts. The old lenders had been paid and had assigned the paper. They no longer had any financial claim against her through those notes. Natalie's face changed for half a second. Relief. It disappeared immediately when Michael opened the next page. Diana Legacy Holdings had already filed a civil enforcement action based on the written obligations and the evidence that Natalie was attempting to move assets while using false documents to obtain more credit. Earlier that day, a court had authorized a temporary attachment against specific accounts identified in the filing while the dispute was reviewed. The freeze did not exist because I snapped my fingers. It existed because a judge had signed an order and the financial institutions had been served. Michael handed Natalie a copy. She pulled out her phone and opened her banking application. The first account showed restricted funds. The second showed the same. She tried to move money into Eric's account. The transfer failed. Her breathing became shallow. "What did you do to me?" "Nothing you didn't sign for," I said. She scrolled faster, checking one account after another. The available balances she depended on had been locked, subject to the court order. The luxury life surrounding her had been built on credit temporary transfers and debts she assumed someone else would eventually pay. Now the person holding the paper was standing in her living room. My living room. Natalie looked at Michael. "You can't just take everything," Michael answered calmly. "We haven't. The order identifies specific accounts and preserves funds while the court reviews the claims. You have counsel rights and an opportunity to challenge it. But you cannot move the money tonight." That legal reality was more frightening than the fantasy of gangsters Natalie had used to control Eric. There was no one to intimidate, no broker to charm, no deadline she could postpone with another lie. There was only documentation. She looked again at Diana Legacy Holdings. The name hurt her. Months earlier, she had mocked Diana as a penniless dreamer. Now Diana's name sat at the top of the company, holding the debt. Natalie could not escape. Natalie sank onto the edge of a chair. The room around her seemed to tilt. Guests who had spent the evening admiring her house were whispering openly. Some had already moved toward the exits. Others remained because scandal was stronger than courtesy. Eric stood near the staircase. He had not left. He watched Natalie turn toward him and understood instantly what she wanted. "Do something," she said. He did not move. She demanded that he call the banks. She reminded him that his credit had once been perfect. She told him to open new accounts, move whatever money remained, borrow against anything he still owned. Michael stopped the instructions before Eric could react. Any attempt to move attached funds after service of the order can create additional legal problems. Eric looked down. Natalie screamed at Michael to stop talking to her husband. Then she turned on. The insults came first. Poor mechanic. Fraud. Old man. Liar. Then came the questions. How much money did I have? How long had Michael worked for me? How could I afford to buy her debt? Why had I lived in that house and worked in a garage if I had access to this kind of power? I answered only one. Because money was never the point. She laughed once, but there was no humor in it. I told her she had mistaken visible consumption for wealth and quiet work for failure. She had assumed that because Diana and I did not advertise what we built, there was nothing behind us worth respecting. That assumption had guided every decision she made. It had guided her toward Eric. It had guided her toward my house. It had guided her toward forged documents and predatory lenders. Now it had guided her directly into a room where every exit depended on facts she could no longer control. Natalie grabbed the debt notice and tore it in half. Michael did not react. The order remains valid whether you tear your copy or not. She threw the pieces at him. Her hands were shaking. Then her eyes found Peterson near the staircase. He was still inside, still watching, still holding the briefcase that contained months of communication with his client. Natalie pointed at him. "Fix this." Peterson did not step forward. He looked at the torn paper on the floor, the court attachment order in Michael's hand, and the guests quietly filming the scene. Something in his face hardened. He had spent the entire night moving away from Natalie, one careful step at a time. Now he had reached the point where survival required him to choose a side. He tightened his grip on the briefcase and looked toward Michael. The next betrayal was about to come from the man Natalie had paid to protect her. The attachment order also solved another contradiction Natalie had never considered. She had assumed becoming someone's creditor meant possessing unlimited power over that person. It did not. Diana Legacy Holdings could not enter her accounts by force seize random property or punish her without process. The court had frozen only the funds identified in the filing, because Michael documented the assigned notes, the attempted fraudulent borrowing, and the risk that she would move money before the dispute could be heard. That difference mattered to me. I had spent my entire life repairing machines by respecting tolerances. Force a bolt past its thread, and you destroy the part you are trying to secure. Law worked the same way. Natalie kept treating every rule as something to bend until it broke. I was doing the opposite. Every move Michael made had to survive daylight. The wealthy people around us did not know those details, but they understood the result. Natalie could no longer pretend she was being attacked by a random old man. A recorded deed, a court injunction, an assigned debt portfolio, and a signed attachment order were all pointing in the same direction. Her problem was no longer me. Her problem was the paper trail she had created herself. The living room had become a room full of people waiting for the next collapse. Natalie remained near the center of the hardwood floor with the debt notice in her hand. Michael stood several feet away. Eric had retreated toward the staircase after smashing my phone, but he had not left the house. He stayed close enough to hear everything frozen, between fear of Natalie and fear of what the cloud recording could still do to him. Peterson was also still there. He had withdrawn from the property fight, but instead of walking out into the rain, he remained near the staircase, gripping his briefcase with both hands. For several minutes, he watched Natalie unravel. Then something changed in his expression. Professional panic replaced loyalty. He approached Michael. "I need to speak with you," Peterson said. Michael did not move. Peterson lowered his voice, but the room was quiet enough that the people nearest us could still hear. He admitted that he possessed emails, text messages, draft loan documents, and voice messages Natalie had sent him during the weeks leading up to the attempted transfer of my house. He said some of those messages contradicted the story she had given him when he prepared the possession demand. Others showed that she knew the property was not legally hers and still wanted documents written as if Eric controlled it. Natalie turned toward him. "Stop talking." Peterson ignored her. He told Michael that he wanted to make a formal proffer through independent counsel and cooperate with investigators. He asked whether Michael would receive a copy of the material and confirm that Peterson had come forward voluntarily. Michael's answer was immediate. "I can receive evidence and preserve the time of your cooperation. I cannot promise you immunity. Only prosecutors can decide what your cooperation is worth." That sentence stripped away the last fantasy in the room. Peterson swallowed and nodded. He opened his briefcase and removed a small encrypted drive. Natalie stared at it. The drive was barely larger than a thumb, but she reacted as if he had pulled out a weapon. Peterson explained that he kept a complete client communication archive because Natalie frequently changed instructions and later denied giving them. The archive included her directions to pressure me out of the house, her description of the private lenders, her request that he make the transfer appear voluntary, and several messages discussing the new power of attorney. Michael held out an evidence envelope. Peterson placed the drive inside. Natalie screamed. She crossed the room before anyone expected her to move. Her nails caught Peterson's cheek as she grabbed for the envelope. He turned away, shielding it with his body. Natalie struck him again and shouted that he was violating attorney-client privilege. Peterson shouted back that he was not going to help conceal ongoing fraud or threats. The argument became physical. Natalie grabbed his tie and pulled. Peterson stumbled into a narrow side table. A crystal vase hit the floor and shattered. Guests jumped backward. Someone screamed. Natalie clawed at his jacket, trying to reach the briefcase and the evidence envelope at the same time. She called him a traitor and threatened to destroy his career. Peterson stopped looking like her lawyer. He looked like another person trying to get away from her. The two private guards moved closer, but hesitated. They had already learned how dangerous it was to act on Natalie's commands without understanding the legal situation. I did not tell them to attack her. I told them to keep everyone away from the broken glass and make sure Peterson could step back safely. Michael secured the drive inside his briefcase. Natalie saw him lock it away. Her rage changed into panic. The messages were no longer under her control. That was when the first siren became audible outside. The sound was distant at first, almost hidden beneath the rain. Then a second siren joined it. Natalie stopped fighting. Red and blue light began to move across the front windows. She looked at Michael, then at me. "What did you do?" I did not answer. Michael had already provided investigators with the financial records, the recorded deed, the attempted loan package, and a cloud copy of the forgery video before the party reached its final confrontation. Peterson's drive was not the evidence that created the case. It was another piece arriving at exactly the moment he chose to save himself. The sirens grew louder. Cars stopped in front of the house. Peterson backed away from Natalie and wiped blood from his cheek. Eric remained beside the staircase, unable to move. Natalie looked from one man to the other and finally understood what greed had done to every alliance she depended on. Her lawyer had chosen himself. Her husband was too frightened to protect her. The creditors she feared no longer controlled her debt. The house was not hers. The money was gone. And now the law was at the door. Peterson's decision did not come from courage. It came from arithmetic. He had watched Michael dismantle one legal fiction after another. He knew the difference between representing a difficult client and becoming part of a continuing fraud. More importantly, he knew that walking away with the evidence still hidden in his briefcase could look very different later if investigators discovered he had possessed it while Natalie kept using forged documents. That was why he moved toward Michael instead of the front door. Natalie understood his calculation immediately. "You work for me," she shouted. Peterson looked at her for a long second. "No, I am a lawyer. Those are not the same thing." The sentence triggered another wave of whispers through the guests. Peterson explained that some communications might be privileged and others might not. He was not going to decide that question in my living room. He would preserve the material, retain his own counsel, and make a lawful proffer to prosecutors. The encrypted drive contained copies, so the originals would remain intact for review. Michael agreed with that approach. He did not tell Peterson he was safe. He did not offer him a secret immunity deal. He told him only that voluntary preservation and prompt cooperation would be accurately documented. That was the most any private lawyer could promise. Natalie heard the restraint in Michael's words and hated it. She wanted a corrupt transaction she could understand, betray me, and receive protection. Instead, the adults in the room were discussing process evidence and consequences beyond her control. She tried to snatch the drive before Peterson could place it in the envelope. When he blocked her hand, she slapped him. The crack echoed through the living room. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Natalie attacked again. She grabbed the front of his jacket and tried to drag the briefcase from his hand. Peterson twisted away, shouting for her to stop. She scratched his cheek and tore one side of his tie loose. The fight was ugly because there was nothing strategic left in it. No one was pretending to be family. No one was pretending to be loyal. They were simply two people trying to save themselves from the consequences of the same scheme. Eric watched from the stairs and did nothing. That detail told me more about my son than any apology ever could. He had protected Natalie when protecting her meant attacking me. Now that protecting her might cost him something, he disappeared into silence. The first blue reflection appeared across the front windows, while Natalie was still reaching for Peterson's briefcase. Michael saw it before she did. He closed his case and locked both brass latches. The evidence was secure. A second later, the sirens filled the room. The front doors opened and cold rain blew into the foyer. Local police entered first, followed by federal financial crimes agents. They were not responding to a noise complaint. The lead officer carried an arrest warrant issued earlier that evening. After investigators reviewed the financial records, the disputed title evidence, the fraudulent loan package, and the preserved video showing the power of attorney scheme, Peterson's newly surrendered drive would be examined later. It had strengthened the case, but it had not magically produced a warrant in the few minutes since he turned on Natalie. The lead agent asked for Natalie by her full legal name. She stood near the shattered side table, her crimson dress torn at the seam. One hand still trembling from the fight with Peterson. The agent approached her. "Natalie Sullivan, you are under arrest." The room went silent. He summarized the charges tied to the warrant's credit fraud conspiracy, connected to the fraudulent loan application, attempted financial exploitation of an elderly property owner, and forgery-related offenses arising from the false power of attorney scheme. The exact counts would be tested in court. No one announced a prison sentence in my living room. The handcuffs closed around her wrists. That sound finally broke her. Natalie began shouting that the entire case was fabricated. She said I had manipulated everyone because I was bitter about losing control of my son. She demanded that Peterson defend her. Peterson said nothing. She turned toward Michael. He simply watched. Then she looked for Eric. My son was still near the staircase. He had not escaped into the night. He had been standing there through the collapse, hearing every word and watching every person Natalie depended on step away from her. She screamed his name. "Tell them the truth." Eric froze. Natalie pointed at him with both cuffed hands and instantly rewrote the story. She claimed Eric had planned the loan. She said he had forged my signature without her permission. She said she had tried to stop him and had only followed his instructions because she was afraid of losing her marriage. It was an ugly reversal, but it was not surprising. The agents looked toward Eric. One asked him not to leave the residence because investigators would need to speak with him separately. Eric's face turned gray. Natalie interpreted his fear as one last opportunity. She begged him to take responsibility. She reminded him that he was the one whose hand had actually written my name. She said a husband was supposed to protect his wife. Then her begging became an order. "Tell them it was you." Eric opened his mouth. Nothing came out. For 30 years, I had watched my son avoid difficult choices. He let stronger personalities decide for him because surrender felt easier than accountability. That weakness had carried him all the way to this room. Now the same weakness stopped him from sacrificing himself for Natalie. He looked at the cuffs on her wrists. He looked at the agents. Then he slowly shook his head. Natalie's face twisted. She cursed him. She called him worthless, cowardly, and weak. She screamed that she had married a man incapable of protecting anyone. Eric took one step backward. The distance between them became permanent. The agents guided Natalie toward the front door. She resisted at first, twisting her body and shouting at the guests who were still gathered near the walls. The officers tightened their grip and warned her to stop resisting. Phones appeared throughout the room. The same people Natalie had invited to witness her rise now recorded her removal. Her reputation did not collapse because I made a speech. It collapsed because every image she had built around herself was now standing beside the facts. The agents led her outside. Rain struck her face as they placed her in the rear of a police vehicle. The door closed. Her shouting became muffled behind the glass. The convoy pulled away. Only then did the guests begin to leave. They collected coats without saying goodbye. Some avoided my eyes. Others avoided Eric's. The string quartet packed its instruments. The caterers stopped serving. The valets returned keys as quickly as they could. Within minutes, the celebration was gone. What remained was broken glass, spilled wine, abandoned food, and the smell of rain moving through the open doorway. I stood in the middle of the living room, wearing the same stained mechanic coveralls Natalie had mocked when I entered. Eric stood near the staircase. He was not in handcuffs, but he was not free of what he had done. The investigators would question him. The cloud recording still existed. The forged signature still existed. What happened to him legally would be decided by evidence and prosecutors, not by a promise from me. For the moment, he simply stared at the wreckage. His new wife was gone. His friends were gone. The party was gone. The house had never been his. He looked at me as if he had finally discovered that the poorest-looking man in the room had been the only person who understood the true cost of everything around him. I did not offer comfort. The next morning he would come looking for money. That would be the moment he learned what he had actually thrown away. The guests did not know that Michael had contacted investigators earlier in the day. Once the cloud video showed the forged power of attorney, and the lender files confirmed that the document had been submitted in support of a large credit request, he stopped treating the matter as a private family dispute. He preserved the evidence, provided it through counsel, and allowed the authorities to decide whether probable cause existed. That decision did not change my plan to confront Natalie at the party. It simply meant the confrontation would not depend on me personally arresting anyone or threatening prison. I wanted her choices documented in front of witnesses. The law would handle whatever came after. The warrant the officers carried had been issued on evidence already reviewed before Peterson made his last-minute decision to cooperate. His records might broaden the case, but they were not the foundation holding it up. Natalie did not understand that distinction. She kept insisting that Peterson had betrayed her and caused the arrest. The lead agent corrected her only once. "This arrest is based on evidence obtained before tonight." That sentence silenced her. One officer photographed the damaged furniture and the area where she had attacked Peterson. Another collected the debt notice Michael had delivered. The agents asked the security team to preserve its own event footage and requested the names of guests who had witnessed the confrontation. The room that had been designed as Natalie's triumph became an evidence scene through ordinary procedure. When Natalie ordered Eric to confess, I watched the agents rather than my son. They did not pressure him to answer on the spot. One told him clearly that he had the right to speak with counsel before making any statement. Eric looked relieved for half a second. Then he realized the right to remain silent did not erase the video. He glanced toward the hallway where the broken remains of my phone still lay on the marble. I knew what he was thinking. He had smashed the screen. He had not smashed the server. That knowledge settled over him like a physical weight. Natalie saw his hesitation and became more desperate. She promised that if he took responsibility, she would fix everything later. She reminded him of their wedding vows. She told him that a real husband protected his wife. Eric's eyes filled with tears. Still, he said nothing. The officers led Natalie away without resolving his part in the case. That was important. The story did not need me to decide his criminal fate in my living room. His choices were already preserved. Prosecutors could examine them later. My role was no longer to shield him from consequences or manufacture them for him. My role was finished. When the last police vehicle left, Eric looked at me across the ruined room. I could see the question he was too ashamed to ask. Would I save him? The answer would come the next morning. The morning sun broke through the heavy gray clouds, casting long, bright rays of light across the immaculate floor of Michael Rhodes' executive office. I sat comfortably in a high-backed leather chair, holding a warm cup of dark coffee in my calloused hands. The violent chaos of the previous night had completely faded away, leaving behind a profound and absolute silence in the corporate tower. I was no longer a terrified man hiding in a damp basement. I was the undisputed master of my own life, sitting securely inside the fortress of my hidden wealth. I took a slow sip of my coffee and waited patiently for the inevitable arrival of the very last person I ever wanted to see. The heavy oak door to the office opened slowly and hesitantly. Eric walked into the expansive room, and he looked absolutely unrecognizable. He was still wearing the same custom-tailored suit he had worn to the lavish party, but it was now completely ruined. The expensive fabric was deeply wrinkled and stained with sweat and rain. His silk tie was missing, and the top buttons of his shirt were torn open. His eyes were intensely bloodshot and swollen from spending the night, moving between the police interview area courthouse corridors and a cheap waiting room while Natalie was processed. He had absolutely nowhere else to go. His superficial friends had immediately blocked his phone number. His rented house was legally sealed by his aggressive creditors. He was completely broke, entirely desperate, and entirely alone in the world. He did not even glance at Michael, who was standing quietly by the massive window. Eric walked directly towards my chair, dragging his feet across the expensive Persian rug. He stopped a few feet away from me and fell heavily to his knees. He looked up at me with pathetic, desperate eyes and began to beg with a broken and trembling voice. He pleaded for a small financial loan to save his life. He claimed he needed $50,000 for Natalie's lawyer and any court-ordered release security. He whimpered that the federal authorities were holding her in a secure detention unit pending her next hearing and that she was completely terrified of her surroundings. He begged me to help him pay off his remaining credit card debt before the police started looking deeply into his own financial records and realized he was an active accomplice. He tried to manipulate my paternal instincts one last time, telling me that he was still my little boy and that he had simply made a terrible temporary mistake. I looked down at the pathetic, miserable man kneeling on the floor. I did not feel a single ounce of sympathy or fatherly affection. I placed my warm coffee cup down on the polished mahogany desk. I reached into the inner pocket of my faded denim jacket and pulled out a single sheet of pristine white bank paper. I did not hand the document to him directly. I placed it face up on the polished wood and pushed it slowly toward the edge of the desk right in front of his tear-stained face. I calmly instructed him to read the numbers printed at the very bottom of the page before he dared to ask me for another single favor. Eric reached out with a trembling, sweating hand and picked up the crisp document. He wiped his swollen eyes with the back of his sleeve and forced his exhausted mind to focus on the black text. He read the official header indicating a highly secured offshore corporate trust. Then his red eyes drifted slowly down the page to the total available balance. He stopped breathing completely. He stared at the number 1 followed by a 2 and 7 massive zeros. $120 million. He blinked rapidly, shaking his head from side to side in absolute sheer disbelief. He whispered the massive number out loud, as if hearing the syllables spoken into the quiet room would somehow make the impossible reality make sense. He looked up at me completely paralyzed and entirely crushed by the sheer staggering magnitude of the wealth resting lightly on the paper. I kept my voice perfectly flat and absolutely unwavering. I told Eric that the massive fortune on that paper did not come from winning a random lottery or hitting a lucky stock market gamble. I told him that every single cent of that incredible wealth was paid for directly with his mother blood, her sweat, and her ultimate physical sacrifice. I painted a vivid and painful picture of the harsh reality he never bothered to notice while he was growing up. I told him about the endless freezing nights Diana spent sitting in our cramped living room, staring relentlessly at a glowing computer screen until her vision blurred and her hands cramped. I described how she typed millions of lines of complex code while working through exhaustion and relentless physical strain. She built a revolutionary software empire in absolute secrecy because she desperately wanted to secure a massive financial fortress for our family. I explained the decision Diana and I made after the software acquisition transformed our finances. Eric was still young, and Diana was terrified that an enormous inheritance would destroy whatever work ethic we had tried to teach him. We agreed to keep the fortune quiet and continue living simply so he would have to build his own life instead of waiting for ours. In the final months of her life, she made me reaffirm that promise. She wanted Eric to inherit responsibility before he ever inherited wealth. The money was never meant to be a prize for existing. It was meant to become part of his life only if he proved he could carry the weight of what she had built without becoming dependent on it, arrogant because of it, or blind to the sacrifices that created it. I told Eric that he had failed our test in the most spectacular and disgusting way humanly possible. He had actively chosen to idolize superficial luxury over honest labor. He had willingly married a toxic and manipulative predator simply because she offered him the fake illusion of high society status. He had actively participated in a vicious criminal conspiracy to steal a modest suburban house and throw his own loving father into a damp, freezing basement. He sold his soul and completely betrayed his own blood for a few $1,000s in fraudulent loans. He did all of this terrible evil completely oblivious to the fact that he was already standing directly on top of a massive, endless gold mine. The absolute crushing weight of his catastrophic mistakes hit Eric all at once. The profound realization that he could have lived a life of unimaginable luxury and absolute freedom if he had simply been a decent and honest man tore his mind completely apart. He dropped the bank statement onto the floor and buried his face deep into his trembling hands. He let out a loud, agonizing wail that echoed violently off the glass walls of the executive office. He sobbed uncontrollably, gasping desperately for air, as the true staggering cost of his boundless greed finally crushed his spirit into dust. He realized he had traded a $120 million legacy for a ruined suit and a ruined criminal life. I watched him cry on the floor, feeling absolutely nothing but cold and peaceful finality. I leaned forward and picked the crisp bank statement up off the expensive rug. I carefully folded the paper and slid it securely back into the inner pocket of my faded denim jacket, protecting my wife's legacy. I looked down at my weeping, broken son and delivered the absolute final verdict of his miserable life. I told him that Diana would be profoundly disgusted by the sniveling coward kneeling on this floor. I informed him with surgical precision that the trust account was entirely and permanently sealed away from him forever. I declared that he would not receive $50,000 to bail out his criminal wife. He would not receive a single penny to pay off his mounting and dangerous debts. I told him he was going to stand up, walk out of this high-rise office with absolutely nothing, and face the brutal, devastating consequences of his actions entirely alone. 6 months passed since the night my living room turned into a federal crime scene. The freezing rain and bitter winter winds eventually gave way to a bright and warming spring. I sat quietly in the back row of the federal courthouse wearing a simple tailored suit. I blended perfectly into the background, watching the final chapter of a story I had silently orchestrated. Natalie stood before the judge at the front of the massive room. She wore a standard-issue orange jumpsuit that swallowed her thin frame completely. Her expensive designer dresses, her flawless salon hair, and her manicured arrogance were nothing more than a distant and pathetic memory. Her face was pale, and her posture was completely defeated. The federal judge did not show her a single ounce of mercy. He read the overwhelming list of charges with a loud and booming voice that echoed off the high wooden walls. He detailed her massive wire fraud, her conspiracy to commit extortion, and her vicious attempt to steal a multi-million-dollar property from an elderly man. He spoke about the absolute predatory nature of her crimes and the complete lack of remorse she had shown during the investigation. He brought the heavy wooden gavel down and handed down a severe sentence of 8 years in a federal penitentiary, together with full restitution obligations imposed by the court. Natalie did not scream or thrash against the guards this time. The crushing reality of the federal justice system had entirely broken her spirit. She simply lowered her head and let the armed marshals lead her away through the heavy wooden doors. Her empire of lies was officially buried under the crushing weight of absolute justice. I walked out of the courthouse feeling an incredible and profound sense of lightness in my chest. I did not drive straight home after the sentencing. I took a deliberate detour through the industrial and forgotten outskirts of the city. I pulled my vehicle into the parking lot of a small rundown gas station. I parked near the edge of the lot and looked through the dirty glass window of the convenience store. I saw my son. Eric was wearing a stiff green polyester uniform with a plastic name tag pinned unevenly to his chest. I was wiping down a greasy checkout counter with a ragged yellow sponge. He looked entirely exhausted and deeply aged by the severe consequences of his own cowardice. Without Natalie to manipulate him, and without my hidden wealth to save him, he was finally facing the brutal and unforgiving reality of the real world. He had a mountain of residual debt from the credit cards he had foolishly maxed out to fund that lavish and fake celebration. His luxury leased vehicle had been repossessed months ago. He was now working grueling 12-hour shifts just to afford a miserable rented room and a daily diet of cheap instant noodles. I watched him ring up a customer, keeping his head bowed in absolute shame. He moved with a heavy, sluggish energy, completely devoid of the superficial arrogance he had displayed on the day he tried to evict me. He was finally learning the true, staggering value of a single hard-earned dollar. I did not step out of the car to offer him comfort or a harsh lecture. I did not feel the need to rescue him from his miserable circumstances. He had actively chosen his path of betrayal, and I was allowing him to walk it entirely alone. I put the car in drive and pulled away from the station, leaving him to his honest and grueling labor. I drove back to the house I had built with my own 2 hands. The property was no longer tainted by the superficial decorations Natalie had tried to force upon it. I had spent the last few months meticulously restoring the home to its original, quiet dignity. The heavy antique wooden furniture was polished and placed exactly where Diana had always loved it. The faint and comforting scent of vanilla once again drifted softly through the spacious hallways, entirely replacing the cloying floral perfumes of the past. I walked through the kitchen and out into my beloved garage. The space was perfectly organized with my heavy tools resting in their designated drawers. I had even tracked down and repurchased the exact model of the classic Mustang I had sold decades ago to fund Eric college education. The pristine vehicle rested in the center of the garage, serving as a quiet reminder that I had finally reclaimed every single piece of my stolen life. I walked back inside and climbed the stairs, stepping out onto the newly renovated second-floor balcony. The afternoon sun cast a warm golden glow over the quiet suburban street below. I leaned against the sturdy wooden railing and took a deep, slow breath of the fresh spring air. I looked down at the freshly manicured front lawn. A beautiful polished brass plaque was mounted securely on a tall stone pillar near the entrance of the property. It read the Diana Sullivan Foundation for Senior Legal Defense. I had used a significant portion of the $120 million trust to establish a massive charitable organization in my late wife's honor. Michael Rhodes and a team of top-tier lawyers now dedicated their vast resources to providing aggressive and entirely free legal protection for elderly citizens facing family financial abuse. We were actively hunting down predators exactly like Natalie, and stripping them of their unearned power. We were freezing their accounts, reversing their fraudulent property transfers, and putting them behind bars where they belonged. My desk in the home office was now covered in letters of profound gratitude from grandparents and elderly widows who had been rescued from the absolute brink of ruin. Diana had sacrificed her health and her sleep to build a massive financial empire, and I was finally using that empire to protect the most vulnerable people in our society. I stood on the balcony and smiled a genuine and deeply peaceful smile. I realized that my journey over the past 6 months had taught me the most valuable lesson of my entire life. I learned that true family has absolutely nothing to do with shared blood or a shared last name. Blood only dictates a biological connection, but it does not guarantee loyalty. True family is built on a solid, unbreakable foundation of absolute respect, unwavering loyalty, and genuine sincerity. The people who value your heart and protect your peace are your real family, regardless of their origins. The silent adjustment I had orchestrated was entirely complete. The vicious predators who tried to destroy me were permanently punished. The weak and cowardly son who betrayed me was learning his harsh lessons through grueling manual labor. And the innocent people who needed a shield were finally protected by the massive wealth Diana left behind. I did not need to hide in the shadows anymore. I did not need to pretend to be a broken and defeated mechanic. I was a man who possessed immense power, and I wielded it with absolute precision and unyielding justice. I looked up at the clear blue sky, watching a flock of birds soar freely over the neighborhood. I knew with absolute certainty that my beautiful wife was looking down and smiling at the absolute perfection of our restored and quiet world. I closed my eyes and listened to the peaceful rustling of the leaves in the wind, entirely content and completely free. Looking back at the wreckage of my son's choices, I realized the most profound truth about wealth and family. Money is merely a magnifying glass. It takes whatever rests inside a person's soul and amplifies it for the entire world to see. I spent decades hiding my fortune because I foolishly believed that a humble life would automatically forge a strong character. I thought that by shielding Eric from the corrupting influence of unearned wealth, I was guaranteeing his integrity. I was completely wrong. Character is not forged by the absence of money, but by the presence of absolute accountability. True family is not defined by a shared last name or a biological obligation. It is built on a solid foundation of unwavering respect, genuine loyalty, and mutual sacrifice. When we allow our loved ones to manipulate us under the guise of familial duty, we are not loving them. We are simply funding their eventual destruction. Sometimes the most profound form of love you can offer your children is to step back and let them feel the devastating weight of their own consequences. Dignity cannot be inherited, and respect cannot be bought. They must be earned through the difficult and unforgiving trials of real life. I lost my biological son to his own boundless greed, but I reclaimed my own soul in the process. True peace does not come from saving those who refuse to be saved. It comes from knowing your own undeniable worth and fiercely guarding your own legacy.